Welcome to the Goldsmith. On today's program, we're going to fabricate a split shank bezel set Boulder Opal ring out of 14 karat yellow gold. I'm sure you'll find it interesting, so join us, won't you? Welcome to the Goldsmith. Hi, I'm Kendrick Thompson, and as you can see, I'm surrounded by the natural beauty of the Great Smoky Mountains here in East Tennessee. You know, this area has always enjoyed a rich tradition of artisan craftiness. It's in keeping with this heritage that I like to fabricate or construct jewelry with a little more hands-on approach than the typical lost wax casting method known to most. Instead of pouring molten metal into a mold shaped like the final product, we're going to pour the metal into a roughly shaped rod called an ingot. This ingot will then be passed through the rolling mill several times, each time with a smaller clearance between the rollers. This shapes the metal into what's called stock, and it's this stock that we'll use to construct our creation. The first few mill passes begin to compress our ingot into a more uniform square shape. Though still very irregular here, a few more passes will plumb the shape and deform the metal to about 60 to 65% reduction. That's the point at which I like to perform the first annealing stage with this type of 14 karat yellow alloy. Every time a piece of metal is bent, beaten, milled, or drawn, that kinetic energy is stored in the metal as potential energy, or stress, and must be annealed or heat treated regularly throughout the process to relieve the stress and keep the metal from breaking. An induction melter works well for annealing yellow gold because of its ability to efficiently maintain a high temperature. We'll anneal this piece at about 600 degrees Celsius for about half an hour. This slow annealing stage helps to achieve a dead soft state, ideal for further milling. After cooling just a little bit in the air, we quench the metal and freeze its crystalline structure to a very workable state. You might ask, why the trouble of milling when you could pour your metal into shape, then polish it and be done? The fact is, this milling process adds many favorable characteristics to the metal, as well as reducing many undesirable traits that are common in as-cast metal. Reduced to around 3.5 millimeters, we'll anneal and begin passing our stock through the flat section of the rollers. This elongates and reduces the stock further to about 1.5 millimeters thick, and also widens the stock by almost a millimeter. Our piece of 14 karat yellow gold stock has been milled to specification and annealed. Now it's time to begin shaping it into a ring. This we do in the most brutish manner by simply striking it repeatedly with a mallet against a round form called a mandrel. We mark the desired length with a scribe. If possible, mark the cut on stock that is already curved a little, as the desired arc may be a little harder to produce once the join is made. Placing our stock, which has now formed what we call a ring blank, on the sewing jig, we lube the blade, line up the cut, and saw. It's very important to either work close to the back of your jig or stop short of a clean cut, because once that saw blade cuts its last grain of metal, it will come to rest on whatever is in its path. Having filed our freshly cut end flat and manipulated the bends so that the ends are lined up, we fit the joint by running the saw blade through the unsoldered joint. This will ensure a perfect, flat, end-to-end fit and will create a very strong bond when flown with hard solder. This works great for a sizing joint, and though that's what this looks like, it's actually the top of our opal ring. It'll all become clear soon. Applying some flux and some 14 karat hard yellow solder, we prepare to make the first joint. Heat is applied gently at first, using wide strokes. Then we focus our heat a little more intensely on the seam to flow the solder and close the joint. With the first joint made, our stock has begun to resemble a ring. When we come back, we'll start on the bezel setting. Stay tuned. So far on today's project, we've milled our stock, shaped it into a ring blank, and made our first joint. Examine it front and back to be sure it's right. Then we begin to blend the inside seam first. Using a half round file, a few strokes should even out the inside of a well-fitted joint. Now we can move to the outer surfaces. A barrette file is used to smooth and blend the outside of the shank and sides, leaving a slight indication of the seam so we can locate it again a little later. Next, the ring blank is pounded round, smoothly conforming to the mandrel all the way around. When working with milled metal, I like to knock off all the surfaces with a fine cut needle file, just to ensure smoothness and polishability. Now here is the gem we will be setting into our ring. It's an Australian Boulder opal. Not a doublet, but similar in that it has a hard layer of the rock in which it formed, acting as a foundation on the bottom side of the stone. This adds a lot of durability to a typically soft gemstone such as opal. Since the gem is to be worn on a ring, where it will take much more abuse than a pendant or earring, a bezel setting will be sturdier and offer more protection than prongs. Here is the same stock we used to form the blank. Now we'll shape it into a bezel using double round chain nose pliers. We bend our stock to the contours of the stone's circumference, remembering to keep a sense of orientation with an asymmetrical gemstone. I usually eyeball the mark for the first cut. This way I can trim and fit the seam a couple of times to pull it down to an absolutely perfect fit before closing the joint. The stone should rest on top of the bezel with about 3/4 of a millimeter of metal visible all the way around. Just as with the ring blank, before heating this joint we coat it with a slurry of boric acid and denatured alcohol. Igniting this mixture deposits the boric acid as a coating on the piece, which protects the non-gold metals in the alloy from oxidizing when heated. The flux forms a film on the metal which helps the molten solder to flow smoothly and evenly. An important note is that every joint we make here uses 14 karat yellow hard solder. We want a good strong bond, and no lesser flow points are needed unless there is a much more intricate pattern of attachments.
Now we've made the major components. When we return, we'll assemble our creation, so stick around.
Having assembled the basic components of our creation from hand-milled stock, I'm really glad to see that you've returned to watch the piece really take shape. Let's take the blank and find the indication of the seam. Mark a center point at the seam with a scribe. Then, using steel dividers, eyeball a reasonable distance for the split to travel down the shank on each side of the center point. We'll close the dividers to what looks like about half the width of the shank, then run from mark to mark. Do this on each side of the shank, and even if the first line is not dead center, the second creates a tight, clear path for a saw blade to follow. I typically start a line all the way across holding the blank in my hand, but a beginner just should not do this. To lessen the chance of injury, we'll cut the main depth and length using a ring clamp to secure the piece. With a clear, even slice down through about 1/3 of our blank, we take a small screwdriver and begin to pry open the split, just a little. Now, let's run the saw blade through the very first joint we made. This allows us to open the split a little wider with flat nose pliers. On the mandrel, we separate the split forks to exactly the finger size requested by our patron. Exacting measurements here can actually throw us off our game a bit. Remember, the stone and its bezel are asymmetrical, and as such, we're much better off estimating these dimensions, guided by what appears to be a central fit. Placing our bezel over the split forks, we mark the ends for trimming. Once the ends are trimmed, a small amount of tension holds the bezel right in place, allowing us to flow our first attachments. These joints look good, right? Wrong. Here's the real secret to a strong attachment. Using a finer 08 saw blade, we'll zip through each of these joints to fit them perfectly. Do both joints on each side at a time, so you can close them back to the bezel easily together while the components are held in place by the attachments on the other side. Next, we need to round out the bottom of the bezel. It is important for comfort that the inside of our ring be completely circular. We'll strike the piece with a rawhide mallet first to effect the general shape. Then with a chasing hammer we tap until every inside surface is flush against the mandrel. Next, take the dividers, adjust it to a narrow gap, and make 2 sets of marks on each side of the ring at a pre-measured spot. Still using the finer saw blade, we cut laterally across the split forks at each mark. We're not cutting through here, just making a line, so stop when the blade reaches its own depth into the metal. These grooves are widened using a triangular needle file. With the dividers closed a little more, we'll make 2 marks on the longest section of each split fork. Because the shape of this ring will not allow me to use a saw blade in making these lines, I'll use a graver. Here, I like to use the corners of a flat graver instead of a knife edge, because the corners of the flat produce a nice, bright 90-degree trough. Some people prefer to use a powered graver. Personally, I like the old-fashioned manual type. Either way, the key to proper graver use is a sharp tool. Now, if we do this right, we'll produce a design that is somewhat reminiscent of a Greek or Roman architectural column.
We're just a few steps away from completing our project. Don't miss the final results in just a moment.
The shank is split, the bezel installed, and the sides are decorated. Now that you're up to speed, take the dividers and eyeball a few millimeters. Then make a mark from the base of the split. At the apex of that arc, plant your dividers and make another mark. And so on until you reach the bottom of the shank. Start from the opposing split base and do the same thing. We saw a line across the shank to the next arc terminus. This gives us a nice crisscross pattern, as is already done here on the other side. Remember, just make lines, don't cut through. We widen each line with a triangular needle file, creating a sort of raised diamond effect. There's no real need for this texture here, but its position and naturally non-skid surface will add some degree of benefit in keeping the stone topside and preventing twirling around the finger. Using a 3 or 4 millimeter setting burr, we cut a lip or beading upon which the stone will rest. We must produce a steady, even cut and check it periodically with the stone. We've laid the stone in place and will secure it by deforming the surrounding metal down onto it. For this, we use a burnisher. Start with the stout sides of the tool, pushing metal inward, remembering that opal is a very soft stone. Invert the burnisher's orientation and direct pressure in a little more downward angle until the stone is secured. Finally, with the very tip of the burnisher, we roll the top edge completely over and inward. Even though the stone is already secure, this evens and strengthens the top edge of the bezel. Tapping the piece a little will reveal an indicative rattle if the stone is loose. It doesn't appear to be loose, but we'll check it again periodically throughout the finishing process to be sure. Now the construction is complete and it's time to put a shine on our ring. I like to use a variety of abrasives, staged from medium to fine. Here we see an inside abrasive, medium and fine knife edges, as well as a small polishing rod for tight detail. We start with a medium inner shank abrasive. As shiny as the ring is now, we've only used abrasives thus far. Now it's time for an array of polishing implements and compounds. I'm a little compulsive about the polishing stage because inadequate time spent here can render all your previous efforts vain. A knife edge lap with bobbing compound helps produce a smooth, highly polishable surface, especially in the tight spaces. Moving to the polishing machine, we shine the inside first. Then, hit the outside and edges thoroughly with tripoli or bobbing compound on a coarse red wheel. Next, the softer yellow wheel with white rouge. And finally, a stitched white muslin buff with yellow rouge. A small fine weave abrasive bit adds a slight matte finish to parts of our split shank, just to enhance the detail. And it looks to me like we're done and ready for the cleaner. Always be careful putting opals in an ultrasonic cleaner and never use acids or plating solutions. Our ring turned out great, and I think our customer will be pleased. I'm so pleased that you've decided to hang out and watch the entire process. I also really look forward to working with you again on another project, and you can bet it will be a real eye-catcher as well as an interesting story for the patron. I'm Kendrick Thompson, and I hope you'll come again to visit the Goldsmith. Thanks for watching The Goldsmith. Be sure and tune in next week for another interesting project.